Part 2 of the manual. This is a continuation of Part 1. Money. Money is a very strange concept. There will be points in the forthcoming months when you might not have the change in your pockets to get the bus into town at the same time as you are talking to people on the telephone, in terms of tens of thousands of pounds. Some of the following might seem contradictory, but in matters of money they often are. We spoke earlier of how being on the dole gives you a clearer vision of how society works. What it doesn't do is give you a clear idea of how money works. After you spend any time on the dole, you either resign yourself to the economic level your life is at and cope, or things start to slide. The rent goes into arrears. The electricity goes unpaid. The gas board threatens to cut you off. When this starts happening, a paranoia begins creeping in, telling you modern society is geared to working against the individual and you in particular. The late 80s reaction to this is invariably to realize that the only way out is for you to become suddenly very rich, and none of this will matter anymore. You will start to fantasize about becoming very wealthy and how very shortly it will happen to you. You only have to make the smart move, find the right key, make the right contact to be discovered for what you are. Your fantasy will be fueled by everything. Nobody wins the pools. There is no such thing as a fast buck. Nobody gets rich quick. El Dorado will never be found. Wealth is a slow build, an attitude to life. I'm afraid the old adage that if you look after the pennies, the pounds will look after themselves is always true. That said, you must be willing to risk everything. That's everything you haven't got as well as you have got, or nothing will happen. The reason we say all that stuff above about there is no such thing as a fast buck is because we are bombarded with information about eternally adolescent pop stars who have just done deals worth this much or have just grossed that much on their last U.S. tour. Firstly, the figures quoted, if true, are always the gross sums, not what's left after all the necessary expenses have been taken into account. Secondly, they will be encouraged, even pressurized, into adopting lifestyles that will eat through whatever is left of the vast sums that have been quoted at us in no time at all. Unless they are able to sustain or repeat at regular intervals, their quoted financial luck will soon be back to no money situation. We are afraid those on the dole who have let their rent go into arrears, their electricity go unpaid, and with the creeping paranoia about this evil society, will be the same ones who, if they were to achieve sudden wealth, would in no time at all be owing insurmountable back debts to the taxman, have managers demand their percentages long after the money was spent, and swapping their paranoia about society for paranoia peppered with bitterness that they have been ripped off all the way along the line. Money, as often quoted, is not the root of all evil. We do know what the root of all evil is. That is to be explained in one of our future manuals, and if we were to tell you the answer now, you would not bother trying to have a number one. We do not expect this chapter on money to have fulfilled in any direct, practical way in making the number one slot, but it might have helped dispel any illusions you might have had. Banks and their direct and practical functions. Our age will be remembered in the future as a period in history when banks went to ridiculous and unparalleled lengths to compete with each other to win the allegiance of the young and account-free. If future historians were to base their research on what young Britain was like in the late 80s solely on the substance of bank adverts, you would definitely be rated as the most despicable types since we were kicked out of the garden. So please, if you do take notice of the bank and money ads, forget it. That said, we are afraid you are going to need a bank account, and the better the relationship you can develop with your bank, the easier things will be. Our relationships with banks have always been fraught with difficulties. Banks are in the business of making money by lending it. The more they lend, the more they make. They want us, the punter, to become addicted for life to the false sense of security it gives us. Banks will go to extremes thinking up new and ingenious ways of getting us to borrow money from them. First and foremost, they want us to get into property, buy a house, because with your property as security, they can always lend you more and more money. If things were to go badly wrong and you weren't able to keep up with the interest payments, they can always force you out of house and home and get their money back that way. Of course, it would be bad for the banks if they were seen to be throwing too many families onto the street or forcing businesses to the wall in order to redeem their loans. They would always prefer to lend more money so as to help pay off the interest on the earlier loans. Banks have spent millions over the past few years trying to destroy the public's old impression of the bank manager in bowler, brolly, and pinstripe, to the approachable and amiable sort of chap who will attempt at all times to say yes. They have only done this not because they like being nicer, but to seduce you into coming in and borrowing more money. Remember, when you are going in to see a bank manager, you are going to see a pusher dealing in one of the purest, most addictive drugs, money. If for some reason you already have some property, or have a family who are foolish enough to indulge your wilder whims and provide you with collateral, you will be at a disadvantage. As you sit there in the sucker's seat in the manager's office, he will smell the scent of securities. He will be checking your wrist veins to sink his syringe in, and at all times he will be telling you about the Genesis CD he had just bought, or how you would never guess it, but he used to be a punk and still treasures his copy of Neat, Neat, Neat by the Damned. So it is best to go in there skint and with no securities. Of course, there is no point in asking to borrow any money. Just put yourself in the bank manager's position. Some unlikely youth comes in, looking like nothing in their ad campaigns, and makes some outrageous request for £20,000 unguaranteed loan to finance the making of a #1 hit single. Would you let them have the money? If this lad were to start brandishing a copy of this publication by the Timelords, you would advise him that he had been had and should get a refund on the book instantly before going out to look for an available vacancy on a youth training scheme. As we said in the introductory chapter, having no money sharpens the wits, forces you never to make the wrong decision. There is no safety net to catch you when you fall. If you already have an account with a bank, make an appointment with the manager or his assistant. If not, get into any branch. The nearest to where you live will do as long as it's one of the big 5. Open a current account and make that appointment. Do this on Monday afternoon while you're out and about. The appointment should be for some time that week. Just tell them that you are setting up a small independent record label. No big plans yet, just aiming to put out the one single and see how it goes. Tell him there will be a couple of times when you will have to issue checks before others have come in. No big stuff. You will let him know beforehand. The most important thing is to get a report going with him. Attempt to keep him in touch with what is happening over the next few weeks. As well as having the pusher's instincts, the bank manager has the instincts of the old mother hen. The small business accounts are his baby chicks, and he loves to watch them grow. If you were to go in and try to convince him of world domination plans, he could only be disappointed in whatever results you had. It is necessary that he should feel part of it all when everything starts to take off. It will be then that you will need his serious help. It will be then that you will have to find £17,000 by the end of the week, and there is no sight of anything coming until the beginning of next month. Monday evening. Spend Monday evening around at some mate's house. See if he has any records worth borrowing. More importantly, tell him what you are up to and see if he has any great ideas worth using. It is a little-known fact, but when it comes to creative ideas, the majority of people are creative geniuses. Your mate is bound to be one of them. It's just that all these folks never dare to translate their creative brilliance into reality. We guess a couple of libraries could be filled with the reasons why they never attempt it. Something to do with mother and when she first said no. That night, don't forget to set the alarm for 8 a.m. the next morning. Before you do whatever it is you do before you go to sleep, see what group names are beginning to float up. Mates are also a great source for group names. Tuesday morning. The history of pop music has been littered with all sorts of unlikely people plucked from obscurity and chucked on top of the heap. Pop music would be thrown out of the showbiz ball if it could not provide its full quota of rags to riches stories. We have all heard the old tale about how it was the downtrodden working-class background that provided the true grit passion in the artist's work that won the hearts and minds of the masses. The other side of the same coin is that it is because of the downtrodden and working-class background that the smart middle-class machine was able to unwittingly, maybe, but ruthlessly all the same, exploit these raw and gullible talents to the full. With each new generation in pop music, there comes along some sort of revolution where supposedly the kids are able to get up and do it for themselves. Skiffle bands, protest singers, beat groups, pop rockers, U2 and Casio kids. Of course, the kids do very little for themselves. They might believe they are. Their public are encouraged to believe they are. All that is happening is that the new, young, waving fields of corn are allowed to grow full and ripe before a very strange combine harvester will come along and pick the few lucky ears of corn, while the rest of the field cheer, wither, and die. A new harvest is always needed. 1988 saw the latest would-be revolution happen in pop music. The DJ, with his pair of Technics and box of records, can make it to the top, with a little help from a sample machine, squiggly bass line, and beatbox. Yet again, this was interpreted as the masses finally liberating the means of making music from all the undesirables, and now terminally unhip. These records were reportedly made for very little money. The common ingredient these records had was far more important than the icing of now style that covers the age-old golden rules of pop, is that they are being made by complete unknowns. No hype, no massive record company advances, no front covers in the rock papers, no loyal following built up over months of solid touring. They have all been released by what is commonly known as indie record labels. However, this is not the place to define indie. Since the rise of the indie label in the days of post-punk, they have provided a healthy means for no-hopers, outsiders, and terminally angry types to unload their angst. They have also proved rich hunting grounds for the major record companies looking for fresh meat. The indie record companies were cottage industries fueled by enthusiasm, passion, and belief. Some grew, became strong, and established international links, whilst others withered and died. The strong ones were able to provide platforms for the artists who were able to build up large and loyal followings to develop and prosper, even have moderate hit single success. The Smiths and New Order on Rough Trade and Factory, respectively, were the obvious champions in this. It was always understood that it was only the major record companies that had the infrastructure, the money, the efficiency, the might, the power, and the means of persuasion to take singles all the way to the top. Like the giants of Fleet Street, weighed down by ancient union agreements and strapped to out-of-date means of production, the major record companies are beginning to look like lumbering dinosaurs. Over the past 10 years, anybody with overtly commercial material would never have considered using the indie network. Everybody with an eye on the top spot knew that the indie scene was for the spotty and marginal, and people who celebrated the glories of being spotty and marginal. The majors were secure in their knowledge of this. All through these years, alongside the scratchy and austere indie labels, has grown what might be termed the independent service industries, providing services that previously only the majors could command. Numerous pluggers, publicists, sales force, and most important of all, reliable and comprehensive distribution. All of these independent service industries are now highly organized and competing to cut deals with you, the much sought-after client. Each of these individual services will have a section dedicated to their own peculiar practices. However efficient and organized these service industries became, they could only do so much with the spotty and marginal. But it was only a matter of time before something came along from within the indie scene that was neither spotty nor marginal and had definite mass appeal. That record was Pump Up the Volume by Mars. It was a turning point. That record not only became number one in the UK, it became an international smash. The indie scene in this country since then has been filled with a newfound confidence. Everything can be achieved. It was as if having a number one single was the last bastion of the majors. Certain cynics will point fingers and whinge that the indies of today will be just the majors of tomorrow. Wasn't Richard Branson and his Virgin Records the ultimate hippie ideal in the early 70s? We won't deny that behind the majority of indie labels is a would-be Branson, whose stunted megalomania will undoubtedly be reflected in the way he brings up his children. From now on, whether or not the technology makes the traditional musician's craft redundant, the young creative type will become more aware that he is able to control more areas of the way his music is communicated to the masses. The manipulation of this control will become a very important creative form of expression in itself. Of course, there is a place for the major record company in the future, and there is still a place for brass bands, large national orchestras, and Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals. The precise function the major record companies will play in the music business as we turn the corner into the 21st century is something we are not going to bother guessing at. One thing they, and we suppose all major international companies, are good at is moving the goalposts, probably because they own them in the first place. As more and more creators of music begin to realize that it is possible to make records themselves and steer those records in whatever direction they want, at the same time as retaining all the copyright in the product, thus a bigger chunk of the action, the attractiveness of signing your soul and its products away from now to eternity, well, at least 50 years after the day you die, will become to look rather silly. Nothing to do with ideology, just straightforward business sense. 25 years ago, no unknown artist signing to a major record company would dare demand the right to only record their own material. The success of the Beatles changed that. In the past 10 years, it has become the trend for the writer of songs to retain the copyright of their work and either just get to the publishers to administrate it or have their own accountants do the lot. If the rise of the UK indie label can be seen as a positive offspring of punk sensibilities, a very negative one was the cult of the very big advance. This can be traced back to the supposed situationalist shenanigans of Malcolm McLaren. The idea that the major record companies were somehow being ripped off and some clever scam was being pulled was totally false. There was no great rock and roll swindle. The 4 living ex-members of the band have nothing left except fading memories of their glory days, like fuddled old soldiers, a front man trapped by his own cynicism and a corpse forever young. While the record companies and publishers involved are still getting bigger and stronger and the employees are busy negotiating their next rise over the expense account launch, it's as if Malcolm never understood Faust. Another point that we can throw in at this juncture is that down through the history of pop music, the cult of the Svengali figure has often risen. Svengalis might be very interesting characters, but invariably make bad businessmen. They spend too much of their time cultivating their own image and coping with their own creative urges. We repeat, it has only been possible since the beginning of 1988 to single-handedly achieve what this manual is about. The myth of the major label deal is totally blown. Their might and power is too slow-moving. Their seduction techniques threadbare and dated. The barn door cannot be closed. While the new technology might be the downfall of any kind of standards in the world of television, in both printing and music the future is ours. Just after 1 p.m. Tuesday. Just after 1 p.m. Tuesday, telephone the studio that you have booked and tell them that you are going to need someone who can program. Ideally a programmer who can play the keyboards. Every studio can get one for you. This programmer is going to be the person who will provide, sample, originate, compute, even play all the music you will need on the record. They usually have a boffin's mentality mixed with the talent of a musical wizard. We are afraid they will not be included in the price of the studio, but the studio manager should be able to sort out the going rate for you and cut the deal with him. Get him booked for the full 5 days. Have a spot of lunch and read the following chapter. It will allay any doubts you might have in your talents as a hit songwriter and explains the golden rules. Between now and next Monday morning, you are going to have to come up with the goods. Those goods are out there waiting for you to find before the others get there. The golden rules. Lieber and Stoller, Goffin and King, Barry Gordy, Chin and Chapman, and Peter Waterman have all understood the golden rules thoroughly. The reason why Waterman will not continue churning out number ones from now until the end of the century, and others had only limited reigns, was not because Lady Luck's hand strayed elsewhere, or that fashion moved on. It is because after you have had a run of success and your coffers are full, keeping strictly to the GRs is boring. It all becomes empty and meaningless. Some have become emotionally or business-wise embroiled with artists whose own ambitions now lie elsewhere and far from merely having number ones. Lieber and Stoller could walk into a studio tomorrow and have a worldwide number one in 3 months if they were so motivated. The basic golden rules as far as they apply to writing a debut single that can go to number one in the UK charts are as follows. Do not attempt the impossible by trying to work the whole thing out before you get into the studio. Working in a studio has to be a fluid and creative venture, but at all times, remember at the end of it, you are going to have a 7-inch version that fulfills all the criteria perfectly. Do not try and sit down and write a complete song. Songs that have been written in such a way and reach number one can only be done by the true songwriting genius and be delivered by artists with such forceful, convincing passion that the world has to listen. You know the sort of thing. Sailing by Rod Stewart, Without You by Nielsen. What the golden rules can provide you with is a framework that you can slot the component parts into. Firstly, it has to have a dance groove that will run all the way through the record and that the current 7-inch buying generation will find irresistible. Secondly, it must be no longer than 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Just under 3:20 is preferable. If they are any longer, Radio 1 daytime DJs will start fading early or talking over the end, when the chorus is finally being hammered home, the most important part of any record. Thirdly, it must consist of an intro, a verse, a chorus, a second verse, a second chorus, a breakdown section, back into a double-length chorus, and outro. Fourthly, lyrics. You will need some, but not many.